Greetings to everyone. Welcome back once again to my educational channel on biology. In this video, we're going to discuss the menstrual cycle. Now, the menstrual cycle is a series of natural changes that occur in a female's body. These changes involve the systematic and well-coordinated secretions of 5 different hormones such as estrogen and progesterone. There are also changes in the uterus and ovaries. So the role of the menstrual cycle is to prepare the body for fertilization and pregnancy. But if there's no pregnancy, the whole cycle will repeat. So let's find out more about the menstrual cycle. The learning standards for this lesson are as follows. 15.3, the menstrual cycle. So after this video, we should be able to analyze the changes and explain the changes in the levels of hormones involved during menstruation, then follicle development, the thickening of the endometrium in the uterus, ovulation, which is the release of the ovum from the Graafian follicle into the fallopian tube, and then the corpus luteum formation. So the first question we're going to answer is, what is the menstrual cycle? Briefly, right? So a brief outline of the menstrual cycle from day 1 to 28 will be discussed, and then the events that occur, we'll find out what are the main events that occur in the menstrual cycle and what are the hormones involved. So what is the menstrual cycle? Now, the menstrual cycle in brief is a series of events that occur in a female's body after the female has achieved puberty, or the girl has achieved puberty, and the menstrual cycle lasts 28 days per cycle, right? So 3 main events occur. So in each cycle, 3 main events occur, which are A, the breakdown and shedding of the endometrium, or the lining in the uterus here that's made out of blood and tissues. And when it breaks down, it will come out as a menstruation. That is the flow of blood and tissues out from the body. And generally just call that bleeding, right? So this occurs from day 1 to day 5 in the menstrual cycle, in which the first day of the menstrual cycle is when the bleeding begins, right? So menstruation is the process whereby the menstrual blood will come out from the body, and this may occur for about 5 days. So this is just an estimation. For some women it's shorter, and for some women it's longer. Okay, so day 1 to 5. Now next, thickening of the endometrium, so that it's rich in blood vessels. So we can see in the first picture here, this shows you the cross section, or the section through the endometrium, right? The section through the endometrium, and we can see here that the endometrium is filled with blood vessels and tissues. So it will thicken with time from day 6 onwards to day 28 of the menstrual cycle, right? And this process is stimulated by hormones such as estrogen, and later on by progesterone also. This is to prepare the embryo for implantation, Okay, so in case there's fertilization in the fallopian tube here, whereby a sperm fertilizes an ovum or secondary oocyte, then the resulting zygote and embryo will travel down into the uterus to implant or be attached to the endometrium in order to get nutrients for growth. Okay, so the thickening of the endometrium is to prepare for implantation of embryo. That occurs from day 5 to day 28. Now, apart from the thickening of the endometrium, another event occurs in the ovary here. Okay, so in the ovary, there is a primary oocyte that will develop to form a secondary oocyte, or immature ovum, right? You can look at the second picture Y here, right? So from day 1 to day 13, the oocyte is developing inside the ovary to form a secondary oocyte. And then on day 14, there is the release of the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube, as seen here, during ovulation, right? So this is to prepare for fertilization in case there is sperm sperms in the fallopian tube, then fertilization may occur, right? So, but if fertilization of oocyte by sperm does not occur, or fertilization of ovum by sperm does not occur, then the secondary oocyte will die in the fallopian tube, and the endometrium wall will shed again, as seen in the picture X here, on about day 28. So menstruation will occur again, and the menstrual cycle will repeat, right? So that means basically the menstrual cycle involves the breakdown of the endometrium here in this diagram here, and then the thickening of the endometrium again. And lastly, it also involves the development of a secondary oocyte in the ovary and ovulation, whereby the secondary oocyte is released into the fallopian tube. So here is a table to show you the series of events that occur in more detail. Now, from day 1 to day 5, okay, this period of time, there's the breakdown and shedding or removal of the endometrium. And that causes menstruation or the flow of blood and tissues from the uterus. Then, from day 6 to day 14, all right, or day 13, estrogen will stimulate the repair and thickening of the endometrium. Okay, the hormone estrogen will stimulate the repair and thickening of the endometrium. And then from day 15 onwards, progesterone starts to be produced. So from day 15 to day 28, the endometrium will continue to thicken, and you become rich with blood vessels inside due to the stimulation by progesterone, which is another hormone, right? So if there's no fertilization in the fallopian tube, the secondary oocyte will die. And but the endometrium will continue to thicken, okay, until nearly day 28, day 27, day 28. Then it starts to break down again. There's no fertilization, and the menstrual cycle will repeat. Secondly, what are the events that occur in the ovary? Now, take note that the menstrual cycle is regulated in a very systematic way, step by step, and it is well coordinated due to the function of the hormones, okay, the action of the hormones. So firstly, from day 1 onwards to day 13, right, FSH or follicle stimulating hormone, which is released from the pituitary gland, will stimulate the growth of the primary follicle here. This is the picture of the ovary. So FSH stimulates growth of the primary follicle containing the primary oocyte, the white cell here, to form the secondary follicle here. So it will grow bigger and bigger. Then it will form the Graafian follicle, which contains the secondary oocyte. That means as the follicle is growing from primary follicle to secondary follicle to Graafian follicle, the oocyte is developing from the primary oocyte to become the secondary oocyte in the Graafian follicle. That's from day 1 to 13. Now on day 14, another hormone from pituitary gland, the luteinizing hormone, stimulates ovulation to occur. So in ovulation, the Graafian follicle will burst and release the secondary oocyte, as seen here, into the fallopian tube. Okay, that's ovulation, usually on day 14. Now next, day 15 to 20, the corpus luteum is formed, all right, from the remains of the Graafian follicle. It's a yellow body, and it secretes two hormones, progesterone and estrogen. So this progesterone and estrogen will stimulate the thickening of the endometrium, right? Okay, so here we see progesterone and estrogen are secreted from the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum will degenerate if there is no fertilization in the fallopian tube. There's no fusion of sperm and ovum. All right, then the corpus luteum degenerates, it becomes smaller and smaller, and the secretion of progesterone and estrogen from it will also be reduced. So when the level of progesterone and estrogen are very low, then the endometrium will start to break down again, and a new menstrual cycle will occur. Here is an animation that shows you the changes in the thickness of the endometrium in the uterus from day 1 to day 28. Let's watch this. Day 1, menstruation occurs because endometrium breaks down. Day 7 onwards, the endometrium thickens. until day 27 or 28. Okay, so day 1 to day 5 menstruation, day 7 to day 28 or 27, the endometrium thickens, and then it breaks down again, and menstruation occurs again. So this second animation shows us the development of the follicle and the primary oocyte inside, and then the formation of the corpus luteum. Let's start with day 1. Primary follicle grows to form secondary follicle and then grafting follicle. Ovulation on day 14. Day 15, corpus luteum is formed and then degenerates later on if there's no fertilization. Okay, okay, one more time. Primary follicle, follicle grows, secondary follicle, grafting follicle, ovulation, corpus luteum forms, secretes progesterone, degenerates, and then starts all over again. Here's another diagram that shows us the overview of the menstrual cycle, all the events that occur in it. So actually there are 4 phases in the menstrual cycle, namely the menstrual phase, follicular phase, ovulation phase, and then the luteal phase. Okay, let's talk about the menstrual phase. So in this phase, the endometrium breaks down and is shed, and menstruation occurs, right? So there's bleeding and there's a flow of blood from the uterus. That's from day 1 to day 5. Next, from day 1 to day 13 in the ovary, the follicle starts to develop. So this is called the follicular phase. Now, the follicle develops from the primary follicle, it becomes the secondary follicle, and finally grafting follicle. So that is the follicle or egg bag. Now, inside the follicle, the oocyte also develops. From the primary oocyte becomes the secondary oocyte through meiosis 1, right? Now, so other than that, the endometrium undergoes repair and it thickens due to the stimulation from estrogen. Now, thirdly, on day 14, ovulation occurs. So the LH or luteinizing hormone stimulates the release of the secondary oocyte from the ovary into the fallopian tube. Okay, when the grafting follicle bursts, then the secondary oocyte will be released into the fallopian tube. At the same time, the endometrium continues to thicken. Lastly is the luteal phase from day 15 to day 28. This is after ovulation, and the corpus luteum develops. That's why it's called the luteal phase, okay, from this word luteum. So corpus luteum develops inside the ovary and secretes progesterone and a little bit of estrogen. At the same time, the endometrium continues to thicken. Now, how about the oocyte? The oocyte that was released into the fallopian tube, all right? If it is not fertilized, it will die in the fallopian tube and then it will be moved down into the uterus and will come out during menstruation, okay? So after day 28, 27, 28, the endometrium will break down once again when the levels of progesterone and estrogen decreases. Then the menstrual phase begins again and a new cycle begins. So we've just studied the basic outline of the events that occur in the menstrual cycle. Now let's explain the functions of the 5 hormones involved in the menstrual cycle. So what are the 3 structures and 5 hormones involved in the menstrual cycle? The 3 structures are 1, the hypothalamus, 2, the pituitary gland, and 3, the ovary. Hypothalamus and pituitary gland are both found in the brain, and the ovary is in the reproductive system of the female. Now, the hypothalamus is a small part of the brain near the middle part of the brain, and it secretes the first hormone, which is GnRH or gonadotrophin releasing hormone. This hormone stimulates the release of 2 hormones from the pituitary gland. So these hormones are FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. They are secreted from the anterior lobe, okay, which is nearer to the front of the brain, the face, okay, nearer to the front of the face or body. Next, FSH from the pituitary gland will stimulate the ovary, that means the follicles in the ovary, to secrete estrogen, whereas LH from the pituitary gland will stimulate the corpus luteum to secrete the hormone progesterone. Okay, so the 5 hormones released are GnRH, FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone from the 3 different structures. It's a good memory tip to remember the 5 hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle in the correct sequence of the actions, right? So regard it like a 5-member relay team, okay, where one hormone stimulates the release of the next hormone. All right. For example, G stands for the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, GnRH. It stimulates the release of FSH from the pituitary gland. And then FSH stimulates the release of estrogen from the follicular cells in the ovary. Now, estrogen stimulates the release of LH from the pituitary gland. All right. And lastly, LH stimulates the release of progesterone from the corpus luteum, right? So think of the acronym or the short form GFOLP, GFOLP, not FLOP, GFOLP, FOLP, right? This is the short form. Or you can remember the sentence, goldfish on Lucy's pot. A goldfish on top, not inside, on top of Lucy's pot. Okay, so the G stands for GnRH, gonadotrophin releasing hormone, the gold. And then F or fish stands for FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. O or on here stands for estrogen. L or Lucy's stands for LH, the luteinizing hormone. P is for progesterone. Okay, so goldfish on Lucy's pot. So the first hormone that acts in the menstrual cycle is GnRH. It is secreted by the hypothalamus and its full name is gonadotrophin releasing hormone, GnRH. So gonadotrophin, what is a gonadotrophin? A gonadotrophin, as you can see below here, FSH and LH are gonadotrophins. They are hormones that stimulate the gonads or the organs, reproductive organs, such as the ovary and testes, right? So the hypothalamus releases gonadotrophin releasing hormone. This hormone is to stimulate the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland. Okay, so the function of GnRH is to stimulate the pituitary gland to release 2 hormones, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone, right? And this will be transported by blood to the gonads, such as the ovary and testes, where it will carry out its function. Okay, so here we see the hypothalamus is part of the brain, in the brain, and below the hypothalamus is its neighbor called the pituitary gland. That's made up of 2 lobes or 2 sections. The first lobe is the anterior lobe, and then the lobe behind it is called the posterior lobe. Okay, so this pituitary gland will secrete FSH and LH from the anterior lobe here. Now the second and third hormones to discuss are FSH and LH. Both these hormones are secreted from the pituitary gland. So it's useful to note that both FSH and LH act on the ovaries, right? FSH stimulates the follicles and LH stimulates the corpus luteum that develops later. Now let's talk about FSH. So FSH is the follicle stimulating hormone. As its name implies, it stimulates the follicle to grow in the ovary. For example, from a primary follicle, the follicle will develop to become a secondary follicle, and finally the biggest follicle of all, that is the Graafian follicle. All right. At the same time, the primary oocyte in the primary follicle will also undergo meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte. Now, FSH also stimulates the release of estrogen from the follicles. So looking at the follicles here, the red part, the follicular cells here, are stimulated to release estrogen, okay, by this FSH. Now let's go on to LH. LH is the luteinizing hormone, secreted also from the pituitary gland. Functions: it stimulates ovulation to occur on day 14, whereby there's the release of a secondary oocyte. Now, please spell out in full. Here I've used the short form because there's not enough space, right? So LH stimulates the release of the secondary oocyte from the Graafian follicle that bursts into the fallopian tube. This is called ovulation, right? So ovulation is stimulated by LH. But after that, there are more functions of LH. That is, it causes the formation of the corpus luteum from the remains of the Graafian follicle, and it stimulates the release of progesterone from the corpus luteum. So this progesterone will then act on the endometrium to stimulate the thickening of the endometrium after that, right? LH stimulates the release of progesterone from the corpus luteum. So lastly, let's discuss the functions of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, both these hormones are secreted from the ovary, and they have one common function, and that is to stimulate the thickening of the endometrium. Okay, both estrogen and progesterone stimulate the thickening of the endometrium. Right, remember that? Now, let's talk about the other functions. So, estrogen is secreted from the follicular cells of the ovary. What are its functions? It stimulates the repair and thickening of the endometrium and stimulates follicle growth until maturity, so that the follicle can grow from a primary follicle to become secondary follicle and Graafian follicle. Similar function to FSH in this sense. Now, other two functions are like this. At low estrogen levels from day 3 to day 10, when the estrogen levels are slowly increasing, it inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland. So it will reduce the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland and keep these two hormones at a low level. Now, this is to prevent the growth of another follicle, because one follicle is already growing in the ovary. Okay, but later on, as the estrogen level increases, the level of estrogen becomes high, and at high estrogen levels, the estrogen will stimulate and the release of FSH and LH just before ovulation. So it stimulates the release of FSH and LH. Both these hormones, FSH and LH, will rise. Their levels will rise, okay, from day 11 to 14, just before ovulation. Now, this is necessary so that at high levels, the LH will be able to stimulate ovulation to occur, so that one ovum or secondary oocyte is released into the fallopian tube, right, when the Graafian follicle bursts. Now, let's talk about progesterone. So, its main function is to stimulate the thickening of the endometrium so that it becomes rich in blood vessels to prepare for the implantation or attachment of the embryo to the endometrium, right, in case there's fertilization. And secondly, it will inhibit the release of FSH and LH to prevent another follicle from growing, all right? So that is in the later part of the menstrual cycle. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, the endometrium thins down because it breaks down and menstruation occurs, and then the endometrium comes up from the woman's body or the female's body. But after that, estrogen is produced and stimulates the thickening of the endometrium, the repair and thickening of the endometrium. Later on, after day 14, when ovulation has occurred, the corpus luteum is formed and it secretes progesterone and estrogen. So these two hormones will continue to stimulate the thickening of the endometrium, all right, to prepare for implantation of the embryo. Here is a good summary of the functions of the hormones that we have discussed just now in the previous few slides. So this is part of the SMART notes, which you can copy down in your notebook. Now, the useful things here is that I've listed the hormones in the order of their actions, the right sequence, all right, according to the acronym GFOP, okay, or goldfish on Lucy's spot. So G is for gonadotrophin releasing hormone, F is for follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, O is for estrogen, L for luteinizing hormone, and then P is for progesterone. G for, you take the first letters of each name of the hormones. Now, then it's also important to note that one hormone stimulates the release of the next hormone. Each hormone stimulates the release of the next hormone. For example, gonadotrophin releasing hormone, GnRH, stimulates pituitary gland to release the follicle stimulating hormone. Then follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, stimulates the follicle cells in the ovary to secrete or release estrogen. Then estrogen stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete LH, which will then stimulate ovulation to occur. Now, LH stimulates the release of progesterone from corpus luteum. And for progesterone, it inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland, right? So, other than that, the other functions of the hormones have been discussed. So please copy this down and memorize the other functions too, which is commonly asked in the objective question, right? And also asked in the structured questions. Now, the third question, it is to explain with examples the negative feedback mechanism and the positive feedback mechanism in the menstrual cycle. What is meant by negative feedback and positive feedback in the menstrual cycle? Here is a very good diagram to explain the negative feedback and positive feedback that occurs in the menstrual cycle. Okay, these two mechanisms, negative feedback and positive feedback mechanism. Now, firstly, the hypothalamus secretes GnRH or gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which then stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete its hormones, which are FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. So these two hormones will stimulate the ovary to secrete estrogen and progesterone, right? Now, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland are in the brain, and then the ovary is in the female reproductive system below. So here we can see that when estrogen is produced, most of the time it will carry out negative feedback by inhibiting the production of GnRH from the hypothalamus. Okay, so this red arrow shows that it inhibits the secretion from the hypothalamus, which in turn, if there's less GnRH, then it will affect the pituitary gland, right? So the estrogen also inhibits the pituitary gland from secreting FSH and LH. So the level of FSH and LH will also be low, okay, because of the effect from estrogen. So this is called the negative feedback mechanism, and it occurs during most of the cycle. So in the negative feedback mechanism, estrogen and progesterone levels, as the levels of these two hormones increase, the levels of the hormones FSH and LH will decrease. Okay, so progesterone has also an effect to inhibit the effect of inhibiting the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, so that less FSH and LH is released. Right, now this is to prevent the growth and the ovulation to occur involving another the growth of another follicle and another ovulation process from occurring, because there's already one follicle developing and one ovulation process, right? So in the positive feedback mechanism, which occurs only from day 12 to day 14, when estrogen levels are higher, it will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete more FSH and LH. All right. Now this occurs so that ovulation can occur when the LH levels are high. Now here's a frequently asked question. Explain the negative feedback and positive feedback mechanism in the menstrual cycle. Okay. So here are a few examples of negative and positive feedback. Now firstly, for negative feedback, at low levels, from day 3 to day 11, at low levels of estrogen, the estrogen inhibits or reduces the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland, okay, from day 3 to day 11. So this is known as negative feedback in the sense that when level of estrogen increases, the level of FSH and LH decreases instead, okay? So next we have positive feedback. From day 12 to day 14 here, day 12 to day 14, you can see that suddenly the hormones all begin to rise, right? Starting with estrogen. So at higher levels of estrogen, the estrogen has the opposite effect now. It stimulates the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland, so much so that the FSH and LH will reach the maximum levels, because estrogen stimulates the release of FSH and LH at high levels of estrogen. Okay, so this is known as positive feedback, in that when the level of estrogen increases, the level of FSH and LH also increases. So we know why the LH must reach a maximum level. It is to stimulate the Graafian follicle to burst and to release the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. This is known as ovulation. Now next, another example of negative feedback occurs around day 15 here to day 27. Right? Now we can see here that the FSH and LH level remain very low in this period of time. That's because the estrogen and progesterone released from the corpus luteum inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland in order to stop the growth of new follicles. Okay, so the graph for progesterone is not shown here, but actually it increases after day 14 and it peaks, or it reaches the maximum level even higher than the estrogen. Okay, so the pink graph here is for estrogen, the pink curve. So here we find that estrogen and progesterone actually inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland. Okay, so this is form of negative feedback. And these are 3 examples that you can state to answer this question. Fourth question, we're going to explain the graphs of the FSH levels, LH levels, estrogen levels, and progesterone levels in the menstrual cycle. So we're going to explain each part of the graph when the hormones increase in concentration and decrease. Okay. Let's begin by discussing the curve for FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. FSH is denoted or represented by this green line and LH by the yellow line. Okay. So from day 1 until day 3 here, we can see that the level of FSH increases. What's the reason for that? It's because the hypothalamus secretes GnRH, or gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary gland in the brain to secrete FSH and LH. So the levels of both hormones increase. Okay? But after that, the levels of FSH and LH remain low. What's the reason for this? Now this is because estrogen starts to be produced from the follicular cells here in the ovary, the pink colored area. So the estrogen starts to be produced from the follicular cells that are developing, from the follicle that's developing. This is due to stimulation from FSH, right? And then when the level of estrogen increases, it will inhibit the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland. Okay, so this is called negative feedback. So at low levels of estrogen, the estrogen inhibits or reduces the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland from day 3 until day 11. This is called negative feedback mechanism. That means as estrogen levels increase, the level of FSH and LH decreases, right? Opposite effect. But we can see then after that, when estrogen levels peak or reach the maximum level around day 11 to 12, the level of FSH suddenly increases, okay, and the level of LH also suddenly increases. So what happened here? Another process called positive feedback occurs. Another mechanism called positive feedback occurs. So at high levels, the estrogen stimulates instead, not inhibits, but stimulates the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland. Okay, so this is the opposite effect compared to day 3 to 11, right? So when the estrogen levels reach a high level at around day 11 or 12, it stimulates the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland, and therefore the levels of FSH and LH will increase suddenly, right? Now this is important because at high levels of LH, the Graafian follicle will then burst and release the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube, okay, due to stimulation from the high levels of LH, right? So this is the process called ovulation, so that the secondary oocyte can be moved through the fallopian tube and may even undergo the process of fertilization, right? If there is sperm in the fallopian tube. So this is a type of positive feedback mechanism because It's positive feedback mechanism because as the levels of estrogen increases, the levels of FSH and LH also increase. Positive feedback. Okay. But then we see that the levels of FSH and LH decrease again from day 15 to day 27, around day 15 to day 27. What has occurred here? Now, the corpus luteum has been formed after day 14, right? And it will secrete estrogen and progesterone. So here we see that the level of estrogen starts to increase again. And level of progesterone, which is not shown here, also increases, even higher than estrogen. Okay, because these two hormones, progesterone and estrogen, are released from the corpus luteum, which are the remains of the graphene follicle here, okay, that burst. So when the corpus luteum releases estrogen and progesterone, the level of estrogen and progesterone will increase. But these two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, actually inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland. Right? So that's why the level of FSH and LH remain low. Okay, because the pituitary gland is inhibited from secreting more FSH and LH. Now, the aim of this is to stop the growth of new follicles. That's why the FSH and LH are at low levels from day 15 to day 27. Okay? But later, when the levels of estrogen and progesterone decrease due to the degeneration of the corpus luteum, then the level of FSH will start to rise a bit again. Okay? At the end of the menstrual cycle. Now let's discuss the other two hormones, which are progesterone and estrogen. All right, we're going to discuss the shape of the curve for progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone is denoted by the purple line and estrogen by the pink line here. Right? So, firstly, why does estrogen levels increase at the beginning? From day 3 to day 12. That's because the FSH has stimulated the follicular cells here in the ovary to release estrogen. Okay, so slowly the levels of estrogen will increase from day 3 to day 12 until it peaks at around day 12. All right, and then it drops again when ovulation has occurred. But after that, it will increase because of the formation of the corpus luteum, which are the remains of the graphene follicle. The corpus luteum will secrete the some estrogen and a lot more progesterone. Okay, that's why progesterone levels start to increase after ovulation has occurred and after the corpus luteum is formed, right? So LH stimulates the release of estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum, right? It's the LH that stimulates the formation of the corpus luteum and then the secretion of estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum. So these two hormones will increase in concentration in the blood after day 14, and it peaks at around the peaks are around day 22, the maximum level around day 22 or around there. Now next, why does the level of progesterone and estrogen then decreases back again to a low level? This occurs if the corpus luteum degenerates when there is no fertilization. So you can see in the picture here, the corpus luteum degenerates and becomes smaller and smaller. It breaks down. So it will secrete less and less progesterone already. Okay, after less progesterone and estrogen from day 23 to day 28, right? That's why the levels of progesterone and estrogen decreases. Now lastly, let's discuss the answer to this question. Based on the combined graphs of four hormones, that is FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone, explain how hormones regulate the menstrual cycle from day 1 to day 28. 10 marks. Okay, so we need a detailed explanation. So in our discussion of how the hormones regulate the menstrual cycle, we are going to base our discussion on four graphs. The graph for FSH, which is the green line, graph for LH is the yellow line, estrogen is the pink line, and progesterone is the purple line. You must also know the shape of the curves and recognize which hormone it is. All right. So FSH and LH, they peak near to day 14, but LH is at a higher level than FSH. Okay. For estrogen, it has two peaks. near to day 13 and also at around day 21. Progesterone only starts to peak at about day 21, and it is not produced in the first half of the menstrual cycle. It's produced only after day 14. All right. So here we're going to also look at the changes in the ovary, all right, and the development of the primary follicle to become the secondary follicle and also the Graafian follicle. Then in the uterus also we're going to discuss the changes in the thickness of the endometrium. So it is useful to take note that the main functions of FSH and LH are related to stimulating the follicles, and also for LH stimulates the corpus luteum, okay, to secrete progesterone and estrogen, right? Now for estrogen and progesterone, one of its main functions is to stimulate the thickening of the endometrium in the uterus. One of their functions, okay, thickening of endometrium is the thickening of the endometrium. Now, apart from the ovary and uterus, we're also going to discuss the glands in the brain, the endocrine glands in the brain, which are the hypothalamus that secretes GnRH, and the pituitary gland that secretes LH and FSH, right? Whereas progesterone and estrogen is secreted by which organ? Ovary. Okay, think of the word OOPS. OOP. Ovary secretes estrogen and P, progesterone. OOP. Oops. So firstly, what happens from day 0 to day 5? Now, day 0 to day 5 is from here, 0 to day 5 here. So follow the blue arrow here, okay, this period of time. Firstly, the levels of progesterone and estrogen are low. Now, look at graph B here. The levels of estrogen, which is the pink line, and the progesterone, which is the purple line, the levels of these two hormones are low, okay? Why? Because the corpus luteum from the previous menstrual cycle had degenerated, so it didn't produce much of these hormones, right? Now, so when the levels of progesterone and estrogen are low, the endometrium in the uterus will break down and is shed from the uterus. So you can see that the endometrium begins to thin down, okay? The thickness decreases. This shows that the endometrium is being shed from the uterus. It's broken down and shed from the uterus, so causing a flow of blood and tissues out from the body, and that's called menstruation, okay? The flow of blood and tissues out from the body. So the first day of the menstrual cycle is when the menstruation starts to begin, okay? There's a flow of blood and tissues out from the body, right? So remember, menstruation lasts about 5 days, but the whole menstrual cycle is 28 days. So don't confuse menstruation with menstrual cycle. Menstruation only lasts 5 days, not 28 days as was the answer given by some students, all right? When asked how long menstruation lasts, it's around 5 days, okay, around that time. Whereas the menstrual cycle lasts about 28 days. Now, next, in the brain, a day before menstruation. So let's look at this diagram at the top here. The hypothalamus in the brain releases gonadotrophin releasing hormone GnRH, which is transported to the pituitary gland. So GnRH will stimulate the pituitary gland to release the follicle stimulating hormone FSH and luteinizing hormone LH into the blood. So look at graph A here. So we can see the levels of these two hormones increase, right, as they are produced by the pituitary gland on stimulation by the GnRH. Now, in the ovary, FSH then stimulates. Now look at the graph or the picture on top here. FSH stimulates follicle growth. That means the primary follicle here grows to form the secondary follicle and then the Graafian follicle. Okay, primary follicle grows to become the secondary follicle here, and then finally the Graafian follicle, which is produced around day 11. At the same time, the primary oocyte inside the primary follicle will grow to become the secondary oocyte. Okay, the white cell here, it will become the secondary oocyte in the Graafian follicle. Next, in the uterus, the growing follicles release estrogen. Now, this estrogen is released and from the follicles. Okay, now you can see the follicle release the estrogen. So the levels of estrogen will start to increase, okay, from day 1 to day 5 here. Estrogen has the function to stimulate, functions to stimulate maturation of the follicles in the ovary and the repair of the endometrium. So look at the endometrium here. After day 5, you can see that the endometrium starts to thicken again, okay, because the estrogen produced stimulates the repair of the endometrium and thickening of the endometrium in the uterus. But at low levels, now there's another function. At low levels of estrogen here, from day 1 to day 5, low levels of estrogen, the estrogen will inhibit or reduce the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland, right? So you can see that as the estrogen level increases slowly at low concentrations, the FSH and LH levels remain low. They cannot increase much because the release of FSH and LH by the pituitary gland is inhibited by estrogen, okay, at low levels. This is to prevent the growth of new follicles. So as one follicle is really developing, it is vital or necessary to prevent the growth of more new follicles. All right. Now let's go on to day 6 to 14. So day 6 to 14 is from here to here. Follow the blue arrow, okay? This section of the graph. Now, firstly, estrogen level rises in the blood because it's produced by the follicular cells. Okay, so from day to day, the estrogen level is increased, as you can see here, and it peaks on day 12 here. On day 12, you can see it peaks on day 12. So it is transported by the blood to the hypothalamus, and the estrogen will stimulate the hypothalamus to secrete GnRH via a positive feedback mechanism. That means as estrogen level rises, the GnRH level will also increase, right? Will also rise. So a high level of GnRH stimulates the pituitary gland below it to secrete more of the hormones FSH and LH. That's why you see that as estrogen level increases and peaks, the level of FSH also increases until it reaches maximum here, and so too the LH. Now always remember that the LH levels are higher, okay, at day 13 or 14 compared to FSH. That's how we recognize the two graphs. The higher graph is for LH, right? So the LH level rises and peaks on day 13 here, okay, leading to ovulation because LH stimulates the release of the secondary oocyte from the Graafian follicle in the process of ovulation. So the Graafian follicle will burst and then the secondary oocyte will be released into the fallopian tube. And this process is called ovulation. So LH is necessary to stimulate the process of ovulation to occur. Okay, remember that. And then the release of the secondary oocyte from Graafian follicle in the ovary into fallopian tube occurs on day 14, or ovulation occurs on day 14 of the menstrual cycle. So after that, the LH also stimulates the follicular tissue left behind, that means the remains of the Graafian follicle, to transform into the corpus luteum or the yellow body here, right? Now, the third stage is day 15 to day 21 after ovulation. So LH has stimulated the corpus luteum. Okay, look at the first diagram above, to be formed. And then it stimulates the corpus luteum to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so luteinizing hormone has a few functions. Okay, one of the functions is to stimulate the corpus luteum to secrete estrogen and progesterone. The other function is to stimulate ovulation to occur before that, before the corpus luteum is formed. So now we have the rising levels of progesterone and estrogen. Okay, progesterone is the purple line, estrogen the pink line. So you can see that the levels of these two hormones increase because they are secreted by the corpus luteum, and this corpus luteum secretes these hormones on stimulation of LH. Now, the combination of estrogen and progesterone inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland via a negative feedback mechanism to stop the growth of new follicles. So if you look at the graph A here, for LH and FSH, the levels are low because the secretion of or release of FSH and LH are inhibited by estrogen and progesterone, estrogen and progesterone. Okay, this is to stop the growth of further new follicles as one follicle has developed and also ovulation has occurred and one secondary oocyte has moved into the fallopian tube. Now, in the uterus, the progesterone that's produced has one main function. It is to stimulate the thickening of the endometrium, further thickening of the endometrium, enriching it with blood vessels, right? As we can see here, all these blood vessels. In preparation for implantation of the embryo, if fertilization occurs. So the thickening of the uterus is for the preparation, is part of the preparation in case there is fertilization and the formation of an embryo. The embryo will move down to the uterus and implant itself or attach itself to the endometrium, right, to get nutrients. That's why the endometrium has to thicken to provide the nutrients in case there is an embryo that implants in it. Now let's discuss what happens from day 22 to day 28, the end of the menstrual cycle, right? The last part of the menstrual cycle, the fourth stage. So here is the section involved, day 22 to 28 here. All right. So firstly, if fertilization does not occur in the fallopian tube, the decreasing LH levels, as you can see here, LH levels are very low. It will cause the corpus luteum to degenerate, okay, if there's no fertilization. So we can, when we draw the corpus luteum at the end of the menstrual cycle, we should draw it becoming smaller and smaller if there's no fertilization, all right? And when the corpus luteum degenerate, it no longer secretes a lot of this progesterone and estrogen, okay? The secretion of estrogen and progesterone will slowly be reduced as these two hormones are produced from the corpus luteum, secreted by the corpus luteum. Now, in the endometrium or in the uterus, without stimulation from estrogen and progesterone, the endometrium here will break down and shed, and then towards the end here, and then menstruation will begin again in the new menstrual cycle, right? Due to the low levels of progesterone and estrogen, the endometrium will break down. Now, in the brain, the low levels of progesterone and estrogen no longer inhibit the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, so they will start to produce their hormones, okay, because they are not inhibited or stopped anymore by the low levels of by the progesterone and estrogen, all right? So GnRH will be secreted again by the hypothalamus to stimulate the secretion of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland, and the new menstrual cycle will begin. A new menstrual cycle will begin with new follicle growth. So the whole cycle will repeat. Now, if fertilization occurs, it's a different story, okay? If fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube where the sperm fuses with the ovum, then the corpus luteum will continue to grow due to the stimulation from a chemical substance. It will continue to grow and secrete progesterone and estrogen. It will continue to secrete progesterone and estrogen. So the level of progesterone and estrogen should not decrease. If there's fertilization, the level of progesterone and estrogen will still increase, right? And this is so that the endometrium wall will continue to thicken. The endometrium or endometrial wall will continue to thicken to support fetal growth so that the embryo can implant in the endometrium and obtain nutrients for growth, right? That is if fertilization occurs. So that's all for this lesson. Thanks for viewing. Please do share, like, and subscribe. Goodbye now, for now.